Good evening and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Karen Timer-Brown, and I'm the president of Historic Annapolis, and it is such a great honor to welcome you all to the 6th Orlando Ridout the 5th Memorial Lecture. I'd also like to make a special welcome to the Ridout family members who are here this evening, Barbara, and I believe Molly may be attending as well. Like so many of you here, I was a big admirer of Orlando. I was first introduced to his work in 1998. I was an eager grad student and attendee of the now noteworthy VAF conference in Annapolis. And out of this conference, the Architecture in Annapolis Field Guide was born. This is an extraordinary resource that we at Historic Annapolis continue to reference all the time, 25 years later. In fact, at HA, Orlando's work is everywhere, in measured drawings, investigation notes, freehand sketches of molding profiles. I feel his deep love for old buildings, and we benefit from his insights and how they were constructed. The team executing the James Bryce House Restoration Project are employing the same methodologies that Orlando was best known for, growing in their understanding of this great building through intense investigation and documentation. Orlando loved the Bryce House, and so we thought it would be most fitting to invite you all following the lecture to gather together at a place that meant so much to him. Now I'd like to turn it over to Marcia Miller. She's the Chief of Maryland Historical Trust's Office of Research, Survey, and Registration, to come forward and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Julie King.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone. It is really nice to see all of you here. It really does feel like Old Home Week every year when we have this lecture, and it's just really important to me. I'm always delighted to introduce the speakers at this series because I know that their work is continuing the legacy of all that was important to Orlando. Each year, we can be assured that the night will provide new and interesting insights into our heritage and the built environment. But we can also be guaranteed that the questions being asked and the methodologies being used in each presentation continue to meet the high standards first set by leaders in our field like Orlando. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Julie King, is no exception. As a renowned archaeologist, she is a leader in the conversation about Maryland's early history and a bridge between many disciplines. She has worked collaboratively with architectural historians on past and current projects, many of them with our own office, and that are related to interpreting the 17th and 18th century landscapes, often providing expertise when little above-ground evidence survives. I first met Julie when she too was working at MHT, serving as the first director of the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory. Now Julie is professor of anthropology and archaeology at St. Mary's College of Maryland in St. Mary's City, where she researches, teaches, and writes about Chesapeake history and culture. She has received 6 major grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and held fellowships with Dumbarton Oaks, Winterthur Museum, the Virginia Historical Society, and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. From 2003 until 2011, she served as an expert member on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Her book, Archaeology, Narrative, and the Politics of the Past, published in 2012, received a book award from the American Association of State and Local History. In 2018, she received the J.C. Harrington Award from the Society for Historical Archaeology in recognition of her research. Currently, Julie works with the Rappahannock and Piscataway indigenous communities in Virginia and Maryland, respectively. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie King as she speaks tonight on Lord Baltimore and the politics of landscape in 17th century Maryland.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Marcia, and I'm glad you messed up so that I won't be the first one to mess up tonight. So thank you for that. So I want to begin my presentation tonight by thanking Marcia for inviting me to deliver the Orlando Ridout Memorial Lecture. I extend my warm wishes to the members of Orlando's family who are here tonight and to all of you who have come out this evening. It is a privilege and an honor to talk about my research at an event dedicated to the memory of Orlando Ridout. Orlando used his expertise in architectural history to help me be a better archaeologist. And the topic I've selected for my presentation this evening reflects Orlando's influence on how I think about archaeological houses and archaeological landscapes. It is also an honor to be here under the flag of Historic Annapolis, where I got my start in preservation as a junior tour guide. This was in the 70s. I know I look 21. And I was still in high school. I had grown up outside of Annapolis in Anne Arundel County, and thanks to two parents who encouraged my interest, I was bitten early and hard by the history bug. Hanging out in Annapolis was a great way to scratch the itch. I remember meeting Mrs. Wright and working with Mrs. Groverman and Mrs. Fishback, and then moonlighting at the Et Cetera shop on Main Street. And finally, MHT, where I was lucky to work for 19 years, not only with Orlando, but with some of the most distinguished and dedicated professionals in our field. For my presentation this evening, and in recognition of Orlando's distinguished career as an architectural historian and his uncanny archaeological sensibility, I hope to use documents, archaeology, architectural history, and landscape to rethink the politics of early Maryland, that is, of 17th century Maryland. Now, I live in St. Mary's City, so 17th century is the big thing going down there. So often the houses, and when people come, when I'm up here, I'm always telling people I'm from the first capital. Often the houses and the artifacts and the landscapes that we care about are seen as background or backdrops, as kind of interchangeable scene settings, when in fact they actually hold important clues to what people were thinking about and what they were doing in the past. I think that's especially true for understanding politics in a proprietary colony like Maryland. So I'm going to begin at the end of tonight's story. That is the end of Lord Baltimore's political leadership of the Maryland colony. And there are multiple Lord Baltimores, as you might know. It's an inherited title. I'll try to be straight on which ones I'm talking about when I'm talking about them. It was late July 1689, probably hot as the dickens, when a rebel force of about 250 men, calling themselves the Protestant Associators, marched on the Capitol at St. Mary's City. There they found Colonel William Digges, a son-in-law of the Catholic Lord Baltimore, but also the son of a Protestant Virginia governor, barricaded in the brick State House with 100 loyalists. Since the spring, Baltimore's enemies had relayed rumors of a Catholic plot. These rumors have been going on throughout the 17th century, but they really ramped up in 1689. It involved the Calverts and a French and Indian army that were already on their way down to Maryland, intent on killing all of the Protestants. Baltimore had also, to add to this, he had delayed his proclaiming of William and Mary as king and queen, which the rebels used as a pretext for taking armed action. As the rebels, quote, gained the doors and windows of the State House, the loyalists, who were very reluctant to fight, surrendered. Now, with the State House secured, the red dot shows St. Mary's City on this amazing map of Maryland and Virginia prepared by Augustine Herman in 1670. It was published in 73, but the fieldwork was done in 70. I'm getting over a cold. The cold was gone like 2 weeks ago, but my voice still gets a little croaky. So with the State House secured, the rebel force swelled to 700 or 800 troops, and then they began an overland march 10 miles north to Mattaponi, Baltimore's dwelling plantation on the Patuxent, and importantly, the site of the colony's arms magazine. Reaching Mattaponi, the rebels encountered a small force where the Calvert government had holed itself up. The rebels promptly laid siege to the plantation. By the way, Charles Calvert was in England at the time, Lord Baltimore. They laid siege to the plantation, and within hours, the Calvert loyalists had capitulated and the rebels moved into Mattaponi. Their leader, John Coode, went about setting up a provisional government operating from what he called His Majesty's garrison at Mattaponi. After securing Mattaponi, a rebel contingent was then dispatched to Notley Hall, a plantation also owned by Baltimore and located on the Wicomico River, some 30 miles west of St. Mary's City. There are many Wicomico rivers, by the way. Members of Baltimore's family that were then living at Notley Hall fled to Virginia, and the rebels moved right in. So began, and so quickly ended, the so-called 1689 Protestant Revolution. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on what exactly this revolution meant to the history of Maryland. Was it, as historian John Krugler has suggested, the overthrow of an especially oppressive overlord? Or was it, as Lois Carr and David Jordan argued, an effort designed to remove a Catholic leader who appeared to threaten Protestant welfare? Or was it, as Antoinette Souto has written, part of a century of English people across the empire working out constitutional issues? All of these things, I suspect. It's where you stand in the historical landscape what matters. But none of these writers have stood in the actual landscape. And so they have not read much, if anything, into the rebels' on-the-ground actions crisscrossing Maryland in late July and August of that year. Now, this is surprising, given that the colonization project depends on a detailed knowledge and control of space. And in order to achieve its ends, you got to know what this land looks like. And of course, it's all about territory. And this control was based not only in the legal instruments of colonization, such as Smith's 1608 map of Virginia and the Charter of Maryland, from which the Calverts derived their geographical limits and their political authority. But control of space was based in the material world. And that's where architectural historians and archaeologists really have their superpower. When the Protestant associators marched on Mattaponi and Notley Hall after securing St. Mary's City, for example, traveling over variably maintained roads in their heavy outfits in early August, and taking control of two very well-populated plantations. In addition to the family members, there were enslaved people, there were servants located at these properties. And so the Protestant associators did this at no small cost to their effort. And John Coote's decision to establish the rebel government at Mattaponi rather than at St. Mary's City wasn't just some random decision. So in this presentation, I want to focus on those on-the-ground choices and invite you to consider what truths about 17th century Maryland and about the Calverts they might be revealing to us. To do that requires, though, a bit of rethinking of an approach that historians and that archaeologists, too, have long had for understanding the Chesapeake landscape. That is, we historians and archaeologists have typically organized the region's landscape along three domains: capitals, towns, and plantations, which we then treat as separate and distinct and even disconnected entities. Now, capitals are understood as political places where we might think a group of rebels might likely be found. Towns are considered as urban entities, and plantations as the economic engines. There is value in this division of the landscape, but it can also operate to sort of fix how we see the past, tending to obscure how people actually lived in this landscape, going back and forth between all of these places. Plantations, which were the economic engines which we get with tobacco, also played critically important political roles. The 1689 revolution demonstrates that. But considering the broader landscape as interconnected, we get a much better sense of how, in 17th century Maryland, Maryland's Calvert family used landscape to both extend and manage perceptions of the family's power and authority, and secondarily, to manage perceptions of the family's Catholicism. In 1661, Charles Calvert, the son of the second Lord Baltimore, the second Lord Baltimore was Cecil, and Charles will become the third Lord Baltimore, a mere 24 years old, arrived in Maryland as governor. The colony had just come through some really politically trying times, including the struggles with William Claiborne at Kent Island, Ingalls Rebellion, the Battle of the Severn, and only a year earlier, Fendel's Rebellion. Perhaps not surprisingly, given these struggles faced by the colony in these early years, Charles found the situation in Maryland disorganized, and with his father's direction, he took charge of the Land Record Office. He incorporated St. Mary's City. He encouraged legislation to establish towns, and he negotiated articles of peace with the neighboring indigenous groups. Clearly, Charles Calvert was taking charge of the family business. Once in town, Charles moved into St. John's, now an important archaeological site in St. Mary's City, and he carried on his father's efforts to create counties where, well beyond St. Mary's City, Calvert appointees could more effectively represent Calvert interests. See how he's sort of getting control of what's going on. He and his father gave these new counties names, Calvert family names, which you can see here, yet another step in marking the landscape. Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Cecil, Talbot, Dorchester was a friend of the Calvert family. Legislation to create towns, an effort tried a number of times in 17th century Maryland, was not just to create towns in the common understanding that we might have of a town, but designed to create political corporations on plantations owned by supporters of the Calverts, and therefore more easily controlled by the Calvert leadership. This is often referred to as the Town Act. It really is the Trade Act. It does create towns, but it also says some of these plantations are going to serve as ports and places. So it's really gotten a misnomer in the 20th century. But Charles Calvert was also a realist, even at his young age, who understood that town building, or even directing people to a port, had always been a challenge for both Maryland and also for Virginia. He also recognized that the spread of settlement across the colony was showing no signs of abating. So he turned his attention to the one settlement form that seemed to have no problem getting established in the Chesapeake, the plantation. He turned his attention to this to insert and extend his family's presence in the colony. Calvert focused his attention on the mouths of the colony's major rivers, including initially the Patuxent and the Wicomico rivers. Both of these are on the western shore. Wicomico is simply a native word that means neighborhood, so that's why you see it in a lot of places around Maryland, and also in Virginia there's a Wicomico River. Getting control of major rivers was a textbook practice for people in the colonizing biz. Rivers were economically and strategically important, although their environments could also pose physical and political dangers as well. Indeed, Calvert's enemies, Thomas Gerard, Robert Sly, Josiah Fendel, had already established their plantations at the mouth of the Wicomico River before Charles Calvert arrived, and no doubt why Calvert determined he needed to get Notley Hall over there on the Wicomico River to send a signal to his political enemies that they were being watched. 3 plantation sites associated with the Calverts played important roles in the colony's political development. 2 of the plantations include, you've already heard about, Mattaponi, the proprietor's principal residence, and he moved here within 5 years of landing in St. Mary's City. He's like, I got to get out to these rivers, and he moves to the mouth of the Patuxent, and this is where John Coode, if you recall, would set up His Majesty's garrison at Mattaponi. And then Notley Hall, which is where his deputy governor lived, at the mouth of the Wicomico, both of the plantations seized by rebels in 1689. Both plantations were required ports of entry for ships trading in their respective rivers, and both were sites of colonial defense. Importantly, Calvert took the Maryland Council on the road throughout the colony, and archaeologist Alex Flick, who was a student at St. Mary's College when he made this map, he mapped every meeting of the Maryland Council between 1637, the records survive from then, until 1695. And then he created this map to represent how mobile Baltimore, Charles Calvert, and his counselors were. You can see they're meeting all over the place. The black dots, the size of the black dots represents the number of times the council met at a particular place. It's like a little scale. St. Mary's City made sense, of course, but look at both Mattaponi and Notley Hall. It's not really surprising that Maryland's top landlord had council meetings throughout the colony. The processions to and from these places themselves a form, like the map, of marking territory. By contrast, the Virginia governor and his counselors pretty much, with some important exceptions like around Bacon's Rebellion, stay put at Jamestown throughout the 17th century. So with Charles living at Mattaponi, it's probably no surprise that the colony's principal magazine was established there in the 1670s. Inventories of the magazine's contents, and you're seeing one of these inventories in this slide, reveal a building that's stocked with 315 muskets, 101 carbines, a blunderbuss, powder, shot, and other weapons, lists, as will be shown, that are borne out by archaeological testing. The other weapons that are listed were on loan to the counties from the armory at Mattaponi. With this kind of firepower in one place, and Baltimore was afraid of everybody, other Europeans and Indians, from time to time he had guards of up to 30 people stationed at Mattaponi to protect him and to protect the magazine. Now, no inventory survives for Mattaponi, although historians have described it as a country retreat ensconced in the wilderness. It kind of, minimizes it. A kind of second home that might have looked like other earth-fast structures in the landscape. And at the time that these historians were writing this was the conventional wisdom. Everyone, even the richer and the richest colonists, were all believed to live in these humble, earth-fast houses like this one at Turkey Run Park in Virginia. So when we began excavations at Mattaponi, we were in for a surprise. Not only is the Mattaponi house, and you can see a plan of it here, at least 25 by 50 feet in plan, making it an exceptionally large house for this period, perhaps with an as yet undiscovered wing on the back. We haven't dug in that area. The biggest surprise for us was that the dwelling house at Mattaponi was supported by a continuous masonry foundation, fully 2 feet in width. This is a huge foundation. If you know Bacon's Castle in Virginia, it's on a 2-foot foundation. The house appears to have had a full cellar and stood 2 stories with a loft. Fancy tin-glazed earthenware tiles decorated at least 2 fireplaces. Most rooms were plastered. The windows were likely all glazed, evident by this fragment of a lead window framing, still with a piece of glass in its grip. And the roof was covered with expensive, fire-retardant Dutch pan tile. A portion of the cellar floor was covered at Mattaponi was paved with tile, some of which had actually been whitewashed to create a lighter environment in the cellar when servants were in that location. This was a very fancy place indeed. Now, at some point, probably in the 1670s, when that magazine was located there that I just told you about, a defensive log palisade was erected around the building. And you can see the large palisade. You can see the palisade here. You can see the archaeologist where he's kneeling. He's pointing to where it begins. You can see, I'm always afraid to touch computers, but let me touch it. Is it doing something? No, it's not. But you can sort of see brick in the upper left hand in the back, and he's pointing to where it starts at the edge of this building, and it's coming out as a linear thing. And then you can see where there are these large posts on the right. These things are about 6 to 9 inches. And we only sampled a little bit of this because it's on federal property. It's part of the Patuxent River Naval Air Station. And so, we had X number of dollars. And so we didn't want to do too much damage because archaeology, when you dig, does damage. So that was really interesting because most fences had little posts that were maybe an inch or two in diameter. Tracing out that palisade trench, we chased it, we followed it to see what it was doing. We found that it turned a corner, and you can see in the upper part where it's turning that corner with some weird feature in the bottom center. Do you guys see that thing? And it's got like even an orangier fill. You are like getting down into these archaeology weeds with me right now. And I hope you're there with me. But you can see, because people are like to me when I'm talking, and they're like, what the heck is a midden, right? Not everybody knows the jargon. But you can see there's a little bit more orangier fill in that sort of square thing that intersects that palisade. And a post hole and mold nearby where the archaeologist is troweling. You can see a post mold and hole there. We haven't dug it, but we think it's probably part of a bastion-like structure that's enclosing the house. Now this plan view, which you've already seen, but I'm going to go back to it, shows the house with the palisade in light blue, that's what we uncovered, and the dashed lines projecting its path. The magazine itself was located approximately 100 yards east of the mansion. So you can see that Baltimore, or Charles Calvert at this point, he's really fortifying. He's always writing about how he's scared of pirates in the Patuxent. And so he's really fortifying what he's got going here. And then you can see 100 yards east of the mansion, the magazine. And true to what you would expect for a magazine, we have found hundreds of fragments of lead shot. Now we find lead shot all the time, but at this site we found hundreds and hundreds of them with minimal testing. We also found a barrel to a gun, which when you look in the barrel, you see evidence of melted lead. Do you see that? So this gun barrel is probably broken, and they're using it to heat lead to make more shot. Not only was Mattaponi in a class by itself, in its day, Mattaponi made quite the statement. As ships entered the Patuxent, and I don't have pictures of this because it is a naval base today, and it's very hard to even bring a camera on that facility or on that military facility. Their passengers, though, in the 17th century would see upon a high 20-foot bluff, first the magazine, and then behind it, Calvert's house, rising 2.5 stories. No one would have mistaken this house as belonging to anyone other than Governor Charles Calvert. As for Notley Hall, a room-by-room inventory taken in 1679 describes a veritable mansion, probably not too different from Mattaponi. We just happen to have an inventory from that place. The main house at Notley Hall had 10 or 11 rooms, along with 4 passages, including a great hall, a best room, which is a bedroom, and a counting house. 7 of these rooms appear to have been heated. I mean, this is pretty remarkable. This house was probably built about 1672. And the lieutenant governor was a Protestant, a guy named Thomas Notley. The furnishings in the best room, including a fully outfitted feather bed and bedstead, were valued at an astonishing 71 pounds sterling, more than many planters were worth at this time. And that's just the furnishings in a single room. According to the inventory, the Great Hall, or what functioned as the council chamber, contained 22 leather chairs and 2 turkey work chairs, 4 tables, 3 covered in cloth, green hangings, and fireplace equipment. The walls were covered with a looking glass or mirror and 3 framed pictures, and a pewter cistern for rinsing dishes was located at one end of the room, a seriously well-appointed space for council meetings. So we went out to Notley Hall to do some very minimal testing. I depend on funding, and so I get what I can, and then we go do what we can. And we did what archaeologists call a shovel test pit survey. We excavate small shovel test holes every 25 feet here, or some places we do it more or less. And lo and behold, we came down on a brick foundation in one of those shovel tests. With time limitations, we called in our colleague, Dr. Tim Horsley, who graciously undertook a magnetometer and ground-penetrating radar survey of the site to see what was this foundation up to. And Dr. Horsley did not disappoint. His survey revealed a T-shaped structure, which you see on the right hand here, and within the red lines, of at least partial brick construction. The dwelling's main block measured 20 by 50 feet, not that different from Mattaponi, a little smaller, in plan, and the back room 20 by 35 feet, both with a continuous masonry foundation according to Dr. Horsley. The width of the brick foundation, the results of this geophysical survey, and the 1679 room-by-room inventory suggest that Notley Hall was also at least 2 stories in height. The geophysical results also indicate a full cellar under the entire dwelling, including both its main block and its back room. I've done a lot of 17th century sites, and this is really tricked out, as the kids would say. Of special interest is an unusual brick drain originating at the dwelling and running at least 180 feet toward the Wacomico River. This drain represents an early effort to dispose of wastewater, maybe from stuff rinsed in with that cistern. Now, taking all of this rich, albeit limited evidence, we think Notley Hall had this plan and layout. And like Mattaponi, it must have been a sight to behold for ships entering the Wacomico. This image was taken from Notley Hall towards the mouth of the Wacomico, and you can see Virginia way in the background. You see that really light shading, and it reveals, just how direct that sight line was. Now, both Mattaponi and Notley Hall were shiny baubles in a largely clapboarded landscape. But the 2 houses were not the only places where the Calverts were seeking to establish their authority. Further up the Chesapeake, not too far from where we are today, archaeologists from the University of Delaware have uncovered traces of my Lord's gift, the dwelling plantation of Henry Coursey, a member of Lord Baltimore's council. Located in Queen Anne's County, near the mouth of the Chester River, start to see a pattern here, the plan of Coursey's dwelling is strikingly similar to both Mattaponi and Notley Hall, consisting of a main block measuring 20 by 50 feet in plan with this back room, and you can see this is a plan, you know what an architectural plan would look like, and a back room measuring 25 by 25 feet. It looks like this has a porch tower on the front of it, which would be on this side of the building, and then the back room is on the back side. Now, this was a salvage operation, so there's a lot of questions that we may never be able to answer about this, but at least we have the artifacts and the plan of what was there. Although the council never met at my Lord's gift, and the house was of earth-fast construction and not brick, its association with a counselor, its location at the mouth of the Chester River, and its striking similarity in plan to Notley Hall and Mattaponi gave it a form and political symbolism that was both familiar to and easily read by the colony's settlers. Archaeological work in St. Mary City has already pointed toward a major post-1660 building campaign at the former capital. This is a building campaign that the Calverts no doubt promoted. I'm sure Charles Calvert was behind it. The Jesuits were building a brick chapel. A brick state house was under consideration and then construction. And Governor Calvert's uncle, Philip, was planning his own grand brick dwelling that may or may not have looked like this. This is Henry Chanley Foreman's idea of what it may have looked like. Zooming out from what was happening in St. Mary City, this building campaign, as I've talked to you tonight, was clearly underway throughout the colony, focused on the dwelling plantations of the ruling family and their associates. And these efforts were not just rich men building big, fashionable houses, although that is certainly part of it. The archaeological findings reveal important decision-making by the Calverts as they developed this landscape. For example, the colony's magazine was located at Mattaponi and not at the capital, suggesting that military power literally traveled with the person of the proprietor, who had seated himself at Mattaponi in 1665 or 6. Charles Calvert probably also understood, he's probably aware of those rumors about the French and the Indians coming down, He understood that the spatial juxtaposition of a magazine with a Catholic chapel at St. Mary's would have doubly fueled Protestant speculation about a Catholic Indian uprising. So he's noticed how I think part of what he's doing is he's separating these things. Calvert also understood that the Patuxent, Wicomico, and Potomac, all three major deep waterways, provided considerably greater access to the colony's interior than the St. Mary's River that ends not too far from St. Mary's City. And if he didn't get control of these rivers, his enemies very well might. And none of this should be a surprise. The Calverts were seasoned investors in the colonizing effort. George Calvert was the first Lord Baltimore. He had established plantations in Ireland. And he had also established a colony in Fairyland, in today's Newfoundland. He spent one winter there, and he was like, this ain't for me. And he came down to Jamestown, and everybody in Jamestown were like, we know what you're coming from that cold winter. And they were very cool to him about this. But they kept that interest in Fairyland through the 17th century. They didn't just forget it. The Calverts had even invested in the Virginia effort. They had put money towards it. In other words, there is little doubt that this family knew what they were doing. As a proprietorship, essentially the colony's owner, its landlord, the Calverts understood the need to manage the family's proprietorship in the landscape. This, in a way, we don't see in Virginia, a royal colony for much of the 17th century. Now, Charles Calvert often gets a bad rep with most historians. He's the one who lost the colony in 1689, and there's no question that, like his father, he was more than a little authoritarian. The father was too. On the other hand, he understood perhaps more than most of the leaders that his father had previously appointed who weren't family. Charles understood the importance of geography and architecture for asserting the family's authority in managing perceptions of the family's Catholicism, in part by leaving the very Catholic settlement at St. Mary's. In some respects, I think we could argue that without Charles Calvert's geographical understanding, the Calverts may have well lost the colony before 1689. I close my presentation with this magnificent portrait painted by Gerard Soest, probably in the early 1670s. It features Charles's father, Cecil, then the second Lord Baltimore, much older now than he was in 1634. But this is a satisfied man if you really study this painting. The painting situates Baltimore, the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil, in the thick of empire. Here he is wearing a silk Persian vest and coat, quite fashionable, standing on a Turkish rug, which you can see down at the bottom of the slide, with a young African boy serving as an attendant to his grandson. That is Charles's son, who's also named Cecil. And he's also, in the documents, he's referred to as Little Sis. This spatial theme continues with the map in Cecil's hands, a map clearly of the Maryland colony. If you're like me, you know that Potomac River anywhere you see it with that curve up there. Here is a man who by the end of his life, and this is the father, is firmly committed to England and its empire. As a side note, by the way, Cecil Calvert never visited Ireland. He never went to Fairyland. He never came to Virginia, and he never came to Maryland. So in some ways, this is a fiction, right? He's sort of centering himself in this location. But more importantly, we can see this painting as an extension of what Cecil's son, Charles, was trying to do in Maryland, managing perceptions of the family's Catholicism. Here presenting Cecil first and foremost, not as Catholic, but as an Englishman. Or at least I think so. I am not an art historian, and perhaps there are hidden Catholic emblems or other symbolism in this image, and I've shown it to my colleagues at St. Mary's who are art historians, and they don't see anything, but I'm not done, right, because their art history is more like 20th century modern art, that kind of thing. So knowing I am in over my head, I continue to ask other art historians. A student suggested, does the red suggest something? I don't know, and I haven't had a chance to track it down, but let me tell you, I may have more to report later. Cecil's hopes so optimistically expressed in this portrait about space or empire and about time or inheritance, as you can see between the big and little Cecil, would come to be dashed. But after he dies in 1675, his grandson, which he wouldn't know, little Cis, who's going to inherit, dies in 1681 before he can inherit Maryland. He's buried somewhere in Maryland. And in 1689, the family loses political control of the colony. I want to thank everyone attending, these organizations for funding and other support, and thank too Historic Annapolis and MHT for inviting me tonight. And note again how much Orlando's multidisciplinary view of the world underpins so much of my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. That was just such a fascinating look at the connections between geography and architecture and power and politics. It really was an interesting talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, so we're happy to take some questions. Because we are recording this today, we want to make sure that the questions get through the microphone, so I will be repeating them or we'll figure out how it works. So, does anyone have any questions?
Julie, I have a question about the magazine at Mattaponi. Why do you think you found so much in the way of armaments there so much later? Why were they still in, why were they left there, or why would they, how could you find that? Why weren't they taken someplace else or destroyed?
You want to go ahead and just repeat it.
So the question is, if I understand what you're saying, Kak, is that why were there so many arms left behind? And we think that there were actually more arms left behind because we knew children who played there, older people we interviewed who had played at Mattaponi as children in the early 20th century, and they were talking about finding these big guns, and I'm like, and I find this little gun barrel? It's just not fair. But, but I think what's going on is things like the lead shot, the flint, they're small, they sort of get lost in the sauce. The Calverts do get Mattaponi back, and it is inhabitable through the early 18th century. That gun barrel was probably broken. These other guns that the kids had found in the early 20th century were probably broken as too. Their families didn't curate any of those through time, so we weren't able to see them. But a lot of things, archaeologists depend on people to drop and lose things or throw things away. And so I will note that also over at the big house, or at the main house, there are a lot of lead shot and gun flint too, probably because of the garrisons that's there. By the way, you heard me talk about Notley Hall. Notley Hall was built in 1672. The rebels are there in 89, and the house is abandoned, which leads me to believe that the rebels absolutely destroyed it when they were there. Thanks for that question. That's a great question. Yes? Oh.
What was Governor Nicholson's relationship with the Calvins?
So, well, I can't tell you how his relationship was. The question was, what was Governor Francis Nicholson's relationship with the Calverts? And I can't answer that because I just really haven't researched it, but I can tell you this about Governor Nicholson. Governor Nicholson was sort of that guy you bring in to clean up. He's in a lot of colonies. But he understood that Maryland had not a majority Catholic presence, but that there was a Catholic presence. And he seems to acknowledge that. But as far as his politics, the Calverts tried to keep up good relations with the natives. Now, they did it as part of their marking the territory and controlling. And so you can argue, well, that's just, it's just a different side of the coin. But like the Nicholson really ignores them, and then the Piscataway and other tribes are like, we're out of here. And then all of a sudden, Maryland is exposed. So I think there's a difference in governing style, but I don't know what the actual relationship between the Calverts and Nicholson would have been. And that's actually a great question. Tom, did you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think you're right on the money with your interpretation of that portrait, because if you look at English Catholics, rather than pointing to the Romanness of their religion, they point to the long history of English Catholicism. They're not looking toward the continent, they're looking back toward England's past. And I disagree with the reconstruction of the St. Mary's Chapel. I don't think it was a Jesuit Baroque fantasy. I think it was one of a long line of very English, low-level Catholic churches that have been the root of English Catholicism for a millennium. And when you look further into the 18th century, the English Catholic chapels that are being built on private lands are very English, very low, don't look at us on the outside, but on the inside they serve the function of the church. And this idea of being English/American/Marylander first goes all the way up to the construction of the Basilica in Baltimore when Bishop Carroll was presented the two choices between a Gothic revival church and a neoclassical church by Latrobe. He chooses the neoclassical church because he does not want to point back to the foreign roots of Catholicism in many people's minds, but to the Americanness of the Catholic faith in America.
So that was a long question. That wasn't a question, but was actually a really good points about the Catholicism and the representation by English Catholics of Catholicism and what they're doing. And he brought up the chapel at St. Mary's. And of course, I know that there was a lot of discussion and disagreement about what that building should look like. And after I came through this research, I agree that Charles Calvert would not have allowed something to look like it does in Reconstruction, which raises all sorts of interesting questions about how we today interpret the past and who interprets that past. So Tom raised some really excellent questions, and maybe at the end I'll have you come up so that you can speak into the microphone so that the viewers at home can hear, or the viewers in the future can hear. Are there any other questions, or is it getting close to Bryce House time? Yes. Is that a hand? Is that a hand back there? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think this is Bryce House time. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing everybody at the Bryce House.
Julie, thank you so much, and Marcia, thank you as well. I would like to now invite Sharon Kennedy to come up and say a few words about the Orlando Ridout Memorial Lecture Series and how we want to continue his legacy.
Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sharon Kennedy, and Orlando was a friend and a trusted colleague of mine. I spent 15 years on the Historic Preservation Commission for the City of Annapolis and working to protect this unique architectural heritage we have. I could always count on Orlando for his comprehensive research and his persuasive testimony in front of the commission when we had critical and complex projects to approve. Because of that relationship with Orlando, I have anonymously funded this lecture series since its founding in 2016. When we started with HA and the Maryland Historic Trust, and Karen and Elizabeth, and Marcia planned that first event, the role of the State House seemed so important to us because it's where Orlando did some of his most significant work. But it was also a measure of the respect he was granted through his hard work across the breadth of this state. I remember the reply of the two Michaels, Bush and Miller, when we asked for permission to use the rotunda. And the reply was, "For Orlando? Of course you can have it." Well, the challenges of COVID and the demolition of the DLS building, where we used to hold the lecture, has provided us with some new opportunities to rethink this event. Printed on the front of your program is our newly established mission statement for the Orlando Ridout Memorial Lecture Series. Our vision is that this series will gain both a national and an international audience in the years ahead. The pandemic has opened up for us new avenues for audience attention through live streaming events, so that physical presence is no longer a barrier to experiencing high-quality educational events of the type that Orlando provided and inspired. But these technologies are as expensive as they are effective. Therefore, tonight, I am announcing my $3,500 challenge grant to raise money to live stream this program in the future. I will match donations dollar for dollar up to a $3,500 or a $7,000 fund, and anything that is contributed above that will remain in a dedicated account at HA to provide for honorariums and travel reimbursements so that we can bring the very best in the field to this lecture series. Many of you here tonight are generous donors to HA, and for that, everyone is deeply grateful. Your dollars support a wide variety of HA programs and events. So I hope this opportunity will have you consider an additional gift to HA in memory of Orlando Ridout. It has been an honor to work with many of you in this room to keep the legacy of Orlando's work alive and influential. Together as a community, we will face the next chapter in the history of our beloved Annapolis and the broader Chesapeake Bay. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much. And I'm very, very pleased to also announce that we received our first donation for that match today from Peter Miller of Miller and Associates, Miller Dotson Associates. So we have, as you can see on the program on the back, very conveniently, there's a QR code. So please consider this. And again, it's and our commitment in a restricted fund to honor Orlando's legacy. I have a couple other things I want to mention. As was stated earlier, this is going to be recorded and it'll be on our YouTube site. So we will send out a notice to everyone what that URL is. And so that way, for those of you, your friends and family who aren't able to make it, will be able to see it at a future date. And our commitment to continue doing it in this sort of hybrid format. Okay, a few other housekeeping things. We invite you all to come on over and see the Bryce House. Not quite... somewhat on par with I'm going to mispronounce it, Manapanai, but 100 years later. But it is an extraordinary resource, and we're very excited to share it with you all tonight. We will have limited access to the building because, again, it is a construction site, so you'll be entering it in from the west hyphen, and it'll just be the first floor of the main block that's open. There are no restrooms in the building currently, so you'll want to take care of that before. Again, we invite you all to join us, and I'm very pleased too. We have a couple of the Bryce House Dream Team members, Michael Day and Taylor Day, and Jeff Childs and Chris Mills, and I think Willie's going to be here as well. Yes, good, wonderful. Who'll be on hand to answer a few questions as well. So thank you all very much for being here this evening, for your support for Historic Annapolis, and for your love for Orlando. Good night.